Live from York, this is The Late Show with Christopher Vowles.
Good evening and welcome. Tonight we're talking about the Ofsted English Subject review with English teacher Mary Hind-Portley. So join us as we explore the key highlights of the review and reactions to it, the review's stance on reading, and the 4 domains of literature study. As always, we're here to take your calls, so call and text in and join the conversation.
Live from York, this is The Late Show with Christopher Vowles on Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Sunday Late Show. If you've now broken up for the holiday, then well done. It's certainly been a busy time for everyone, not least for the reception staff at the Department for Education. Since we last spoke, we have moved on to our second Secretary of State for Education after Nadhim Zahawi. That's right, James Cleverly becomes the 80th government minister to take up the education brief first established under Viscount Palmerston's Whig administration in 1857, when William Cooper spent 1 year and 16 days in the grandly named position of Vice President of the Committee of the Council of Education. Educated at Eton before entering the Horse Guards, Cooper, later known as Cooper Temple, was a key figure in the development of the 1870 Education Act. Now, as I'm sure the educational historians amongst us will know, this legislation created the school boards that assumed responsibility in England and Wales for the universal education of children aged between 5 and 13, and for building new schools where they were needed to complement existing state-aided and church voluntary schools. The Act established a framework for the inspection of schools to monitor capacity and to maintain educational standards. It made provision for funding schools from taxation, although parents were still required to pay school fees if able to do so. It introduced powers for school boards to make attendance compulsory, and it required that all religious teaching in board schools be non-denominational, an amendment to the bill laid in Parliament by William Cooper Temple himself. 2 years later, on the 6th of August 1872, so 150 years ago next month, the Education Scotland Act of 1872 had an even more dramatic impact on schooling north of the border. This legislation immediately made elementary education compulsory for all between the ages of 5 and 13, and the locally elected school boards created by the Act immediately took over all existing parish and burgh schools. The Free Church of Scotland surrendered 548 schools to the state without compensation in what Alexander Morgan in 1927 described as the state taking the place of the church as the official agent of education. In 2022, Mr. Cleverly and his ministerial team now only have England to worry about, but they still remain responsible for early years, children's social care, teacher recruitment and retention, the national curriculum, school improvement, academies and free schools, further education, apprenticeship and skills, higher education, oversight of the departmental COVID-19 response, and oversight of school infrastructure improvement. Quite a list. Responsibility for education in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, of course, rests with the devolved administrations in Edinburgh, Cardiff, and Belfast. Like his Victorian forebear, William Cooper Temple Mr. Cleverly is a privately educated military man, having attended Culp's School in Lee before Thames Valley University and being commissioned into the Territorial Army in 1993. His most recently recorded reserve service has been with the Royal Artillery Regiment. It will certainly be interesting to see how many communications are fired off from the DFE under his watch, beyond guidance to state schools on implementing the unbudgeted round of staff pay awards for 2022-23, and advice on managing behaviour. I strongly suspect Mr. Cleverly will be moving to another portfolio by September once a new Prime Minister has appointed a fresh cabinet. Will Michelle Donnellan get a second crack as Education Secretary to put into practice the plans drawn up during her 36 hours in the hot seat earlier this month? She has, it should be remembered, served as Parliamentary Undersecretary for Children, Minister of State for Universities, and Minister of State for Higher and Further Education since entering Parliament in 2015. Having supported the now eliminated Penny Mordaunt in the semi-finals of the Conservative Party's leadership contest, Miss Donnellan has yet to publicly back either of the remaining candidates. Will she return to the cabinet by September, or will Suella Braverman be directing England's education policy come the start of the new academic year? Whoever is overseeing schools this summer needs to urgently look at the goings-on at AQA. It has been reported that a 72-hour strike of administrative staff is imminent, although AQA have assured schools that any industrial action will not affect the processing of public examination results. The trouble doesn't end there, though. Hundreds of teachers marking exams for AQA this month have voiced their frustrations over errors in processing payments for work completed, with non-payment and late payment of fees, over-taxation and unwanted pension deductions being experienced by teachers supporting the national examination system in their spare time. Countless markers have reported their challenges in getting answers from anyone responsible for payroll matters on the telephone, while receiving a stream of abrupt reminder emails about marking completion, constant updates to marking advice, and frequent error messages from unstable assessment software. This summer clearly opened with a shortage of experienced examiners. By April, I was receiving nearly weekly flyers by post and by email to sign up to gain valuable insights into the examining of English by scrolling through short answer question after short answer question on a laptop screen for GCSE English language. I was even encouraged to refer a friend. I think it's high time that AQA had a really hard look at how it works with the teaching professionals it relies on to sustain the public examination system and start treating them a little better than it has of late. I am personally very relieved that I chose not to do any exam marking this year. Despite my genuine interest in how exams work and the multiplicity of creative ways in which students attempt to answer the questions set before them, I came to the conclusion that a fortnight-long on-screen marking binge was not the most rewarding way to engage with the subject and the wider teaching community. So instead, I finished teaching in early July and took myself down to London to attend the Idler Festival at the National Trust's Fenton House in Hampstead. Here, on a spectacularly sunny weekend, during what would have been considered a notable heatwave in its own right, had the weather patterns of the last week not brought record high temperatures and garden fires, I spent some time generating nonsense poetry in the drawing room of a Georgian country house with the poet Claire Pollard and a group of fellow sun-dodging seekers after gibberish. It was nice to be able to sit at the back of the class for a change, to have a go at some timed writing exercises drawn straight from the Dadaist playbook, and to hear someone else asking the close reading questions about the Jabberwocky. I also made a small zine for the first time since about 1986, putting together a manifesto on the importance of reading from a blizzard of art school, coffee table magazines, pages torn from the London A to Z, and scraps of wrapping paper. I was sharing the same craft table as a retired resident of Hampstead who was keen to express her long-standing interest in nature, and a young editor for the medical journal The Lancet, who put together a manifesto urging the reversal of recent US Supreme Court ruling on the Roe versus Wade case. There was some time for some blue skies stuff too. The radical economist Guy Standing delivered an intriguing lecture on the disappearance of the commons. That public property formerly held jointly and severally by everyone in society for the enjoyment and benefit of all, which began to vanish with the field enclosures of the early agricultural revolution. Standing was setting out his concerns for the oceans, arguing that these are rapidly becoming commandeered by corporate interests and private finance to the detriment of local people. I also enjoyed Dr. David Bramwell's close analysis of Tove Johansson's book Moominland Midwinter and the evolution of Jansson's now famous hippo-like creatures from their original forms as ghost-like presences in darkened corners of the artist's childhood sketchbooks. My daughter and I are currently reading Moomin Papa at Sea, the final melancholic instalment in the Moomin family saga, a book that is as much about leaving youth behind as it is about the trying to make sense of a world shaped by mysterious grown-ups. Tonight, we are going to explore Ofsted's recently published view on what constitutes a good English curriculum in English schools. No doubt originally intended for publication in 2021 to mark the centenary of the discipline-defining Newbolt report into the teaching of English from primary age through to university or industrial placement, the Ofsted Subject Review of English has met with a mixed response from the subject community. Like the 1921 Newbolt report did after World War I, it offers a fascinating perspective on where the report's authors think English stands as a subject discipline seeking to engage with the modern world. It sets out a view on how the differences between English as a discipline and as a vehicle for other learning might be understood. It presents a summary of research findings into a range of teaching methods used by English professionals. It offers suggestions as to how particular skills and knowledge might be developed. And it offers observations on the role of assessment in measuring learning and driving it. So what does the review mean for you in your classroom? Does it present a portrait of a subject that you recognise from your training to teach? And what new questions does it pose about the nature of English teaching and learning in the 21st century? Mary Hind-Portley and I will take up some of these threads in our conversation this evening, but we would like to hear from you too, so do please call or text us live and join the conversation right after this.
This episode of Teachers Talk Radio has been made possible with support from Witherslack Group, the UK's leading provider of SEN education and care. They're here to support you too through an ever-growing offer of free resources, including webinars, podcasts, articles, and events aimed at supporting teaching professionals like you. Visit their website at www.witherslackgroup.co.uk to find out more.
Imagine a world where you were free to focus on sparking curiosity in your students and giving them access to the awe and wonder of learning. A world where you were supported to deliver a truly personalised education to help all your learners achieve their potential. No need to imagine it, because that's exactly what the Oxford Smart Curriculum Service delivers. Seamlessly integrating curriculum, resources, assessment, next steps and professional development Every component of Oxford Smart is connected and working to provide you with a uniquely coherent and responsive service that empowers you and your students with transformational effect. The Oxford Smart Curriculum Service. When everything connects, anything is possible.
If you have a passion for education and a talent for teaching and learning, the Witherslack Group want to hear from you. Join them as they open an incredible new school in Essex and be a founding teacher of English, maths, science or primary, with multiple leadership opportunities available too. As Teachers Talk Radio partners, we know how much they care about the well-being of staff, and their offer to you will be superb. To find out more and apply for a role, visit www.witherslackgroup.co.uk/careers.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Several media outlets report on a 72-hour walkout planned by staff at Exam Board AQA, which could affect the delivery of GCSE and A-level results. The walkout was announced by Unison in a row over pay, with the union saying staff are struggling to make ends meet because of successive below-inflation pay awards. Employees set to strike include those involved in organising the awarding of grades for both GCSE and A-level exams. The three-day action will take place from Friday the 29th to Sunday the 31st of July. Unison warns that industrial action could escalate unless talks reopen. The Manchester Evening News reports on comments made by the Conservative leader on Bury Council as he launched an attack on teachers, rail workers and junior doctors who may consider striking for better pay. Russell Bernstein, opposition leader on the council, said, "Shame on any teacher who takes strike action," and suggested those who did would be ignoring their responsibilities. He criticised possible strike action at a time when children and young people had finally begun to think about having a normal school year, after 2 years of disruption due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Labour councillors for Bury dismissed his comments as childish and out of touch. With many schools breaking up today, regional news outlets are providing parents and carers with details of activities on offer this summer. In Essex, the council is encouraging people to think outside the car and features activities which can easily be reached by bike, on foot or using public transport. In Islington, the council's Heatwave summer programme offers free, fun, educational activities for all ages, including Caribbean cooking, poetry, filmmaking, roller skating, special effects makeup and animal care. Whilst in Stoke-on-Trent, the Pottery Shopping Centre is opening an indoor beach, complete with deck chairs just in time for the summer holidays. The beach is free of charge and open to anyone. A check of local council and media outlets is a good place to start for ideas this summer. From today onwards, UK degrees will be recognised as the equivalent to degrees from universities in India. The Government of India signed a Memorandum of Understanding with the UK Government, which will allow those taking a degree in the UK to be eligible for employment in India. Those with Indian university degrees will be also treated on a par with UK degree holders and eligible for jobs in the UK too. It is hoped the arrangement will bring a much-needed boost to the UK economy. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio Weekend News with Joe Fox.
This is 2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, this week I'm going to support a question everyone will see at the start of next year. It goes something like this. Hi EduTwitter, can you reply with where you are so I can show my class how far a post on the internet can reach? With a bit of free tech, you can make this much more visual. I'm going to use Google Maps because it's free and most likely you'll have used Google Maps at some point in the past. So, when you have all your responses, sign into Google, go to Maps and click on the menu next to the search box. That's the 3 lines that look like a burger. From the menu, select My Places. You'll now have 4 options: Lists, Labelled, Visited and Maps. Click on Maps and at the bottom select Create Map. Now you can give the map a title so you can find it next year for comparison and add all the places from your Twitter replies. Simply type the name of the place. When it appears with a blue point marker, you can click the plus sign to add it to the map and then select the colour to help it stand out. When you've finished, All places will be saved and you can access the map by following the first few steps. Menu, My Places, Maps. There are loads of other great tools to use also. Measure the distance from your school to those places. Hit Preview and go into the View Only mode. Here you can select a place and you're treated to a short bio and an image of the area. So next time you're looking to bring a lesson to life, why not try using maps to help pupils see where places are in the world? Do you have any top tips for mapping? Why not get in touch at TT Radio 2022? Follow us and tell us what you want to know about tech. I'm Steve Woods, and that was 2 Minute Tech.
2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
Welcome back to our show on the Ofsted English Subject Review. Joining us tonight from Liverpool to examine what the review might mean for English teaching is Mary Hind-Portley. Mary has had a variety of roles in education: teacher, director of English and school improvement. She is co-author of the book Succeeding as an English Teacher, published by Bloomsbury, and is currently Assistant English Subject Leader in a multi-academy trust in Bootle. She has recently been helping shape a new approach to whole school reading so that all students might know that reading, to paraphrase Kate D. Camillo, is not presented to children as a chore or duty, but as a gift. And I'm delighted to say that we have Mary on the line now. Welcome to the show, Mary, and thank you for joining us on Teachers Talk Radio. Hello, Mary, are you there? I'm struggling to hear you, Mary. Are you able to perhaps try again to call in if I just close this call and get you to call back in again? And if you can try and call in again, Mary, we'll see if that fixes the problem. Brilliant. Good evening, Mary. Can you hear me? Good evening, Mary. Can you hear me? Okay, I think we might have a challenge with Mary's microphone. Mary, did you want to see if you could put a different set of headphones in, or have another try? Okay, while Mary's going off to sort out a second set of headphones, we'll see if we can just explore some of the key details, I think, from the Ofsted report. So for those people who have not yet read the review in its entirety, I'll just outline the 5 key points that secondary teachers will want to be familiar with. So these are: 1, that phonics still governs language acquisition in the primary phase. 2, reading is central to teaching and learning. 3, explicit SPAG teaching during composition lessons is endorsed. 4, speaking and listening opportunities should be made frequently available to all. And 5, Ofsted's model of literature teaching distinguishes between 4 domains within the subject. So those are the 5 significant points that came out of our reading of the English subject report. Now, it's fair to say that the response to the review itself has been rather mixed. I understand that the English and Media Centre have put out a significantly lengthy response to the original wording of the review. The English Association have also had something to say about it. And we'll try and see if we can get Mary back with us. Mary, are you able to come back onto the line with us now? Let's try again.
Hi, can you hear?
Good evening, Mary.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Perfect. We can,
Oh,
yes, we can
fabulous.
hear you loud and clear.
I think I've bought new headphones and I don't think they've got a mic on them, which didn't help. I'm here
Okay,
now.
so we're
Some
now
old
in.
headphones.
Perfect. So the old headphones may well do the job. So I've just explained to listeners, Mary, about the
Yeah.
5 key points that came out of certainly my reading of the English Subject Review.
Yeah.
I understand that you've been exploring the English and Media Centre's response to the review. What
I
did they have to say about it?
I have, and it's been very interesting. They take they have a very specific view, as we often know from the English and Media Centre. They're very clear on their approach to English, which is excellent for us. We might not always agree with it, but they are very clear. So they've gone through the report in quite a lot of detail. And they've made a point for each aspect of the report. They introduce it with a blurb and they talk about, one of the things they say is, worryingly, the report barely touches on some key areas of the subject and does not even dip a toe into the research that's available on pedagogy and practices related to them. And they pick out the things that the report doesn't cover, such as poetry and media and creative writing. The first point they pick out, which is interesting in terms of where the report starts, where the report looks at the importance of foundational knowledge and talks about the difference between the modalities and also the pedagogies. The English and Media Centre look at the false separation of pedagogy and curriculum. I don't know whether that's something you'd like me to talk a little bit more about from what they've said.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to explore. What do we mean by those two things?
Well, they talk about here, the Ofsted report states there's a risk that planning for English teaching ends up focusing on using modalities, pedagogy, at the expense of identifying the foundational knowledge of language that pupils need for comprehension or communication. But what the English and Media Centre look at is they say, well, obviously we need to give explicit teaching time to do explicit teaching of each of the forms of verbal communication. And they talk about the knowing how to and the knowing about, which is very popular at the moment in looking at the curriculum. But they do talk about whether there is a confusion here, that there's a very simplistic version, a very simplistic view with the relationship between knowing how to and knowing about. And I think they worry that there isn't a clear idea of what is meant by pedagogy and what is meant by curriculum in the report.
Yeah, I mean, we don't really get much of a sense of what the curriculum is in the report beyond the 4 basics of reading, writing, speaking, and listening.
I would agree with you, and I think that's where the English and Media Centre put forward their point of view, because they then go on to talk about. It says that the document starts to tie itself in knots by trying to make a clear division between the two, and I agree with it. I think that as the Ofsted subject review tries to outline what it means by foundational knowledge, I think it gets itself very confused about what we might mean by knowledge in English other than the knowledge of language, etc. Whereas here, the English and Media Centre talk about if a student completes a writing task by their teacher, they may well draw on an explicit feature of writing discussed, but they will also draw on much more besides. In doing so, particularly if the writing is a focused audience and purpose, they will be reinforcing their understanding of how to write by doing. Additional reflection about their language choices, particularly in conversation with their teacher and other students, will help this process. But it's never an exact science, as made clear by Marshall and William in 2006. So I think that the English and Media Centre are quite concerned about what we might mean by foundational knowledge in a curriculum, and what we mean by the modalities. The fact we do use reading and writing and speaking in order to engage with the English curriculum itself.
Yeah, so a complex web of things to unpick, really.
I would agree.
And if we look at the English Association's response too, theirs was, they largely agree with some of the things that were said by the English and Media Centre.
Yes.
Their criticisms, I managed to narrow them down to 5 in the end. They were particularly worried about the review's approach to English as a single, unified discipline.
Yes.
And that's quite interesting to me, because if we think about it, we have English literature and English language currently in England as 2 discrete GCSEs, although Wales is shortly due to introduce a single combined English language and English literature GCSE to make space for Welsh.
Yes.
And at A level in England, we have 3 different varieties of English at present. Anyway, English literature, English language, and the hybrid language and literature
Yeah.
qualification. And that's before we even consider the place of media studies in English. So, yeah, I've got concerns about the degree to which this subject review applies to a subject as discreetly varied as some parts of the English family are. The second thing they picked out was the sense that Ofsted's review favours a transmission model of classroom teaching. The worry being that this will tend towards scripted teaching. I get the sense that perhaps the English and Media Centre have a similar view on that.
Yes. One of the things that the English and Media Centre do come out quite strongly against is this idea of the upfront teaching of knowledge so that students can access texts. I mean, I have my own opinions about that and about how knowledge is important, but there is a heavy emphasis on knowledge in the subject review. But when you look through it, you look through the review, I think what becomes clear, well, not clear actually, is the review's own understanding of what they mean by knowledge. They do talk about, it doesn't necessarily mean that contextual knowledge should be taught upfront and explicitly at all times. But I think there is a confusion in the report about how we might approach the teaching of certain aspects of knowledge linked to a context of a text. Whereas the English and Media Centre do pick out this emphasis on knowledge and talk about it as being something which can be quite limiting or quite disengaging for some students. Point 8 on their response, where they talk about foundational knowledge, is linked to the advice to structure text almost solely in terms of increasing complexity are numerous references to foundational knowledge. This is knowledge needed in order for further learning to take place. The absence of research related specifically to English, as opposed to more generic research on learning, means that this is presented in a highly simplistic way, assuming that language learning, reading comprehension, writing and learning about texts take place in a linear, logical fashion. And that was one of my arguments with the subject review, that it did seem to present a view of English being linear and logical, where it does have its own logic, but our encounters with English are not necessarily linear like they may be in maths. So that's something I think it's really worth English departments considering when they're looking at their own curriculum and they're looking at what implications the subject review has for them.
Have your department had any thoughts about it at this early stage?
We haven't at the moment because we've been sort of taken up with exam preparation and post-COVID, but the discussion in our department has been very much about what do our young people need and what's our own view as individuals and as a department of what we mean by our subject. And we're very committed to the power of reading, which is a whole school focus as well. But we also want our students to engage in a rich diet of different kinds of writing, and also being able to explore their ideas critically through being able to write critically and engage with texts where they can be critical consumers of it rather than just passive. And I fear that the subject review doesn't lend itself to the richness of different English curricula that we have around in the different departments in the country.
Yeah, I mean, and picking up on your explanation of the English and Media Centre's position on that, again, in that description, we get the kind of the seemingly natural bouncing between English language skills and disciplines and English literature skills and disciplines. And again, I think that is a significant challenge that the English review doesn't quite come to terms with. In terms of the text choice too, I mean, there seems to be seemingly contradictory guidance on how you might go about choosing set texts and the justification for delivering them. That's certainly what the English Association picked out.
Yes, and just looking through the English and Media Centre talk about in point 4 of their response of reading and reading comprehension and narrow focus, which is not specifically about the text, but it's about the emphasis on reading comprehension in the review, which we can come to later. But there is a very strange leap between teaching The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime as a preparatory text for then exploring the yellow wallpaper, linked by the concept of the unreliable narrator. And that's picked up by them and also by, I think it was UCL as well, the Institute of Education at UCL. Picking out that as a slightly strange example of how you might sequence a text. My interpretation of the subject review is that they seem to think that you can plot encounters with a series of texts over the curriculum that's logical and linear, whereas we can look at some linearity between texts, but I don't think that supports a rich and broad as well as deep curriculum that we want our young people to experience. I think that necessarily we revisit texts, or we circle back at times, or we look at a topic that we might look in year 7 but come back to it later in perhaps a different form. So it does worry me about this focus on linearity and increasing complexity of text, where we know that complexity comes in many different forms in terms of reading.
Well, that's certainly true of the learning journeys that I've witnessed my students embark upon over the last 15 or so years. There was something in there too, wasn't there, about the progression in oral English, and that there should be some kind of almost linear progression in that particular skill across all of the key stages too. That's going to be surely a challenge to deliver in many English classrooms.
I think so, because it starts off with the early English curriculum in schools, which I wouldn't want to comment on because I think that's definitely an area for an early years specialist to talk about. But it talks about the importance of high quality spoken language in early years, which I do agree with. And then later on, it comes back to looking at spoken language as a separate section in the report, and talks about a curriculum for spoken language, as you said. It references a number of interesting people such as Robin Alexander and Neil Mercer and Christine Howe, and it talks about dialogic talk. But I do feel that then it doesn't really help us to think about how we might develop spoken language, because developing spoken language is messy. It comes with the encounters you have with the students in the classroom, the ways that children respond, and the text, fiction or non-fiction that you use. So I think it's very hard to plot like a linear and logical development with that. There is a focus on standard English as well in the report too.
Yeah, in terms of the spoken language, though, I was just thinking that it does seem rather perverse to set a new standard essentially for a progressive spoken curriculum when it moves towards a terminal examination in which that skill will count for 0% of the final grade.
It's absolutely interesting you say that, because that's one of the things I've talked in my notes, and we've just done our recordings for year 10. And we know that, that we've had some absolutely excellent presentations, but we know that the young people who we serve come from disadvantaged backgrounds, and often quality of talk isn't always supported and developed at home, and we've got a big job to do there. And also working with our primary colleagues as well, who do an amazing job. But it does seem ironic there's a significant emphasis on spoken language when, as you say, we're not assessing it in an appropriate way at the end of the GCSE. It doesn't allow pupils to show their range of abilities in different types of encounters with spoken language, such as group discussion, exploratory talk, as well as formal presentations. It predicates one particular form of talk, which is a formal presentation. But when that's worth nothing, it's, we make sure with the students get a quality experience of preparing for that, but it doesn't make it seem a central part of the English curriculum when it is a pass, merit or distinction, and it's actually worth no marks at all, as you just said.
I didn't catch the last bit of you broke up there a little bit.
Sorry, when you get to the end of it and the students have worked incredibly hard on their presentations, and it doesn't affect their overall GCSE grade. It's a very small P, M or D next to on their certificate or on their summary of GCSE results, and whether employers take that seriously or not, who knows?
Yeah, it certainly does seem strange, doesn't it? I mean, if we think of modern foreign languages, then speaking,
Yes.
listening is quite a significant proportion of the final assessment. It's almost again like we've decided that English isn't really a proper language because most of the students that take the exams are native speakers.
Yeah, but it doesn't give our young people the chance to develop their skills. And we know that when we look at reports from the CBI, etc., that employers are looking for that wide range of skills: group talk, group presentation, mediating, coming to a decision, collective decision making. That there isn't a process for us to explore those or reward those in school quite so much. And just looking at the headings in the report, when I go back through it, it talks about the summary, it talks about a curriculum, then it talks about teaching activities. And one of the things that I found quite hard about the research review is almost that it doesn't seem to know what its job is. I don't know whether you agree with that, Christopher.
My sense is that it comes back to me, for me, to the kind of problem that English has in being these two disciplines that aren't really quite two disciplines.
Yes.
It's kind of English language and the English literature approach. So, yeah, there's plenty of advice in the report on how to seemingly teach the mechanics of writing.
Yeah.
And how to teach the nuts and bolts on the level of sentences, but then somewhat less guidance on how to put it all together, which is what ultimately I think we want people to do.
Yes, it lacks a sense of cohesiveness and coherence, that if you're sitting with this report alongside the national curriculum thinking, what might we change about our curriculum, or if we were going to rewrite our curriculum from scratch, it seems to be quite a piecemeal set of ideas that don't lend, even though it talks about progression, that don't actually lend themselves to a curriculum built on progression, if you followed all the advice in the report.
Yeah, although it certainly says, doesn't it, that the progression shouldn't be interpreted as competence in tasks set for exam over time. Seems to be that's what it's implying from my reading of it. And of course, we get this sudden rocket out of nowhere, the invention seemingly in this document of 4 domains of literature study for the purposes of the review itself, a view of the subject that's baffled subject experts already, I have to say.
It's interesting. When I was going through and looking at the, just let's check the number, the 286 footnotes in the report, when I was looking at the footnote for that, it comes from, let me turn through the pages. It talks about the 4 domains, but that is based on a book that's aimed at the 16 to 19 teachers teaching English literature, a book which has been recommended by a number of people, and people I know who are teaching A-level do use it, with Carol Atherton, and just looking for the other authors. Caroline, particularly, who I do respect as a teacher and a critic, but it's very much applied to that post-16 teaching of English literature, which I don't think suits us in terms of thinking about, the curriculum at Key Stage 3 to 4, which is where most teachers will find themselves focusing and planning their curriculum. I do
there's that significantly bigger open space, isn't there, at Key Stage 3? I suppose your choices at Key Stage 4 and 5 are largely determined by the exam syllabus you follow.
Yes, I've just found it in here, and it's footnote 230. So just go find the actual footnote with the document, because the book that it comes from, I think, is one that is really helpful for anyone teaching post 16. It's Teaching English Literature 16 to 19 by Routledge in 2013. The authors are C. Atherton, A. Green, and G. Snapper. Whereas where the place it's situated in the report under literature and literary knowledge seems to imply that that's something we should be thinking about, as we've talked about, in Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4, which doesn't fit with the national curriculum, or perhaps how we might want to construct our curriculum, particularly as it starts with the history and development of literature, which is very hard to do when you're planning a 3-year curriculum and then moving on to the 2 years at GCSE, where what you're going to teach is dictated to you by the exam board.
Certainly, and where the set text might change for literature, you might want to then reorganise your historical approach to literature lower down the school, but you may not have enough notice.
And we have put a lot of time into thinking about how do our young people understand like the Western literary tradition in our department? What do they need to know? What gives them access to a wider cultural understanding, which helps them to access the texts we're in? But what we're not doing is we're not teaching the history of English. We're trying to embed it in the genres or texts or movements that we're teaching in the curriculum. Whereas when you're teaching it, depending on the exam board, you're teaching it at Key Stage 5, the history and development of English could be very, very important and central to how you approach a text. I've taught AQA Lit B with the focus on genre, and obviously you do need to understand the development of tragedy over time. Other exam boards I couldn't speak about, but it's all about it's making sure that you're looking at something which is right for the phase, planting it in your curriculum.
Yeah, there's certainly an argument to be had, I think, about the place of literary history in GCSE, Key Stage 3 English curricula, certainly within schools. I mean, English literary history is a kind of dying phenomenon in universities now these days. It's quite difficult to find an English literary history degree.
Yes. I mean, having done my degree a very, very long time ago, the big thing for us was new historicism and cultural materialism at the time, which I did enjoy reading about, but that's not something that you hear quite as much about now, which has certainly helped me think about teaching Shakespeare, for example. But I think those 4 domains, I think, could be unnecessarily used perhaps by maybe senior leaders to say to have conversations about the curriculum. Well, where are these 4 domains in your curriculum, along with your implementation statements and your intent, and subject leaders saying, well, that's not appropriate for Key Stage 3 and 4. Yes, we are looking at those at Key Stage 5, but they're not something we want to structure our curriculum around for Key Stage 3 and 4. I think they're good to talk about and interesting when you're having those conversations about developing your curriculum, but I can see them being taken out of context and perhaps used as a tick list.
So I think there's certainly that risk. We'll return to those 4 domains after the news, Mary.
Yes.
The National Association of English Teachers' criticisms have been a little more muted, but even they were disappointed by the lack of reference to media study, drama, and digital literacy.
Yeah.
Like the English Association and others, they had some doubts about the robustness of Ofsted's evidence base. But where do we go from here, Mary? Surely we can all agree that reading is a central feature of any English curriculum.
Absolutely,
how do you manage reading in your school?
In terms of reading is central to our school. We have a fantastic VP who's led on the implementation of Reading is Power across the whole school. I've been fortunate enough to work alongside her and support this in development. And in our department, we talk a lot about the importance of reading, because we have a number of students entering, who are not reading at their chronological ages. We've got a number of students with difference of 2 years between their chronological age and their reading age, that their reading age is lower than their chronological age. So for us, the teaching of reading is really important, but we know that the teaching of reading is a complex science as well as an art, and it's very important for us to think about how do we do this, but also how do we build on what they've learned at primary, and how do we build on our primary colleagues' expertise in the teaching of reading.
Yeah, one wonders how we might integrate the learning of vocabulary as well, as we attempt to give students that confidence and capacity to read fluently.
Because we know there's a link between the vocabulary that students have, their expressive and their receptive vocabulary, as well as they've been able to decode and understand vocabulary in reading. And we know that the wider the vocabulary a student has, the more likely they are to succeed at GCSE, and the more likely they are to be good at reading. But it's a fine balance, isn't it, of trying to build a curriculum that develops vocabulary when encounters vocabulary can be quite random depending on the text that you're using, but also the fundamentals perhaps for some students of going back to decoding. And there's a big emphasis, like we discussed preparing for this, about the teaching of phonics, and where the teaching of phonics sits perhaps within a secondary curriculum, or whether that's an appropriate emphasis in some of the inspections that we've seen recently. But for me, the teaching of reading is alongside the selection of texts and how you put those together in a coherent and cohesive manner.
And that's something I think we'll look at again after the news, Mary. So we'll go to the news now, and then we'll pick up this idea of what literature might be as a subject according to our own views and those of Ofsted. So we'll be right back shortly.
Thank you.
This episode of Teachers Talk Radio has been made possible with support from Witherslack Group, the UK's leading provider of SEN education and care. They're here to support you too through an ever-growing offer of free resources, including webinars, podcasts, articles, and events aimed at supporting teaching professionals like you. Visit their website at www.witherslackgroup.co.uk to find out more.
Imagine a world where you were free to focus on sparking curiosity in your students and giving them access to the awe and wonder of learning. A world where you were supported to deliver a truly personalised education to help all your learners achieve their potential. No need to imagine it, because that's exactly what the Oxford Smart Curriculum Service delivers. Seamlessly integrating curriculum, resources, assessment, next steps and professional development, every component of Oxford Smart is connected and working to provide you with a uniquely coherent and responsive service that empowers you and your students with transformational effect. The Oxford Smart Curriculum Service. When everything connects, anything is possible.
If you have a passion for education and a talent for teaching and learning, the Witherslack Group want to hear from you. Join them as they open an incredible new school in Essex and be a founding teacher of English, maths, science or primary, with multiple leadership opportunities available too. As Teachers Talk Radio partners, we know how much they care about the well-being of staff, and their offer to you will be superb. To find out more and apply for a role, visit www.witherslackgroup.co.uk/careers.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Several media outlets report on a 72-hour walkout planned by staff at Exam Board AQA, which could affect the delivery of GCSE and A-level results. The walkout was announced by Unison in a row over pay, with the union saying staff are struggling to make ends meet because of successive below-inflation pay awards. Employees set to strike include those involved in organising the awarding of grades for both GCSE and A-level exams. The three-day action will take place from Friday the 29th to Sunday the 31st of July. Unison warns that industrial action could escalate unless talks reopen. The Manchester Evening News reports on comments made by the Conservative leader on Bury Council as he launched an attack on teachers, rail workers and junior doctors who may consider striking for better pay. Russell Bernstein, opposition leader on the council, said, "Shame on any teacher who takes strike action," and suggested those who did would be ignoring their responsibilities. He criticised possible strike action at a time when children and young people had finally begun to think about having a normal school year, after 2 years of disruption due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Labour councillors for Bury dismissed his comments as childish and out of touch. With many schools breaking up today, regional news outlets are providing parents and carers with details of activities on offer this summer. In Essex, the council is encouraging people to think outside the car and features activities which can easily be reached by bike, on foot or using public transport. In Islington, the council's Heatwave summer programme offers free, fun, educational activities for all ages, including Caribbean cooking, poetry, filmmaking, roller skating, special effects makeup and animal care. Whilst in Stoke-on-Trent, the Pottery Shopping Centre is opening an indoor beach, complete with deck chairs just in time for the summer holidays. The beach is free of charge and open to anyone. A check of local council and media outlets is a good place to start for ideas this summer. From today onwards, UK degrees will be recognised as the equivalent to degrees from universities in India. The Government of India signed a Memorandum of Understanding with the UK Government, which will allow those taking a degree in the UK to be eligible for employment in India. Those with Indian university degrees will be also treated on a par with UK degree holders and eligible for jobs in the UK too. It is hoped the arrangement will bring a much-needed boost to the UK economy. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio Weekend News with Joe Fox.
This is 2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, this week I'm going to support a question everyone will see at the start of next year. It goes something like this. Hi EduTwitter, can you reply with where you are so I can show my class how far a post on the internet can reach? With a bit of free tech, you can make this much more visual. I'm going to use Google Maps because it's free and most likely you'll have used Google Maps at some point in the past. So, when you have all your responses, sign into Google, go to Maps and click on the menu next to the search box. That's the 3 lines that look like a burger. From the menu, select My Places. You'll now have 4 options: Lists, Labelled, Visited, and Maps. Click on Maps and at the bottom select Create Map. Now you can give the map a title so you can find it next year for comparison and add all the places from your Twitter replies. Simply type the name of the place. When it appears with a blue point marker, you can click the plus sign to add it to the map and then select the colour to help it stand out. When you've finished, all places will be saved and you can access the map by following the first few steps: Menu, My Places, Maps. There are loads of other great tools to use also. Measure the distance from your school to those places, hit preview and go into the view only mode. Here you can select a place and you're treated to a short bio and an image of the area. So next time you're looking to bring a lesson to life, why not try using maps to help pupils see where places are in the world? Do you have any top tips for mapping? Why not get in touch at TT Radio 2022? Follow us and tell us what you want to know about tech. I'm Steve Woods, and that was 2 Minute Tech.
2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio. You've been listening.
Welcome back. I'm discussing the recent Ofsted English Subject review with teacher and assistant English subject leader Mary Hind-Portley. We've just been discussing the highlights of the review and how reading might be managed in the context of the review's recommendations. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on the subject as we move on to explore what the review has to say about literature teaching. Had you ever heard of the 4 domains of literature study before they appeared in the Ofsted review? How does one best balance the benefits of teaching whole texts with those that stem from the study of extracts? And what literature knowledge is genuinely thought of as knowledge of the text, as opposed to background knowledge? So let's start with the 4 domains of literature. Now, Ofsted defines these as 1, the history and development of literature; 2, the craft of the writer; 3, the response of the reader; and 4, the nature of literary study. So, Mary, are these anything more than a framework for the drafting of examination assessment objectives, or have Ofsted come close to finally resolving the what is literature question? Are you still with me, Mary? Can you hear me, Mary?
I can hear you, yes.
Perfect, you're on now.
Sorry.
So did you have a view on those 4 areas?
Well, as somebody who's taught English literature at A level, I do find them very interesting. And as somebody who likes to think about what we're moving some of our pupils towards, depending on which different schools that we're working, I'd like to see as many of my young people as possible choose an A level subject in English or another A level subject. I do think they're useful domains for us to think about, and we're looking at the curriculum. But obviously, if we're in a state school, we are duty bound to deliver the national curriculum, or in a national curriculum, or something which we can plan to be better. And I think as well, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about increasing complexity and what that might be, and at times bringing things down from perhaps post-16 study that may be inappropriately challenged for young people, like the race to introduce more and more challenging texts into Key Stage 2. So if we think about the response of the reader, we can bring in some perhaps critical theory about reader response theory. But I think it's important first and foremost to think about what are we trying to teach our young people in Key Stage 3 and what do they need. Pupils do need to understand the craft of the writer and how a text is constructed. And we need to teach them about that. But I think that those domains are perhaps a level which may add too much complexity for us planning the curriculum and too much confusion when they are essentially taken from a book which is about teaching literature 16 to 19.
Yeah, there is the problem, isn't there, of stuff being pushed further and further down the curriculum. So how do you go about organising your Key Stage 3 reading curriculum?
In terms of our reading curriculum, we've got, this is something we've been discussing. I've been at my school for a year now, and we've been discussing what that looks like. And we've made a number of changes this year, and we'll probably go on making changes until we get close to something that we feel that is as right as we can make it, but also adapting to new texts as they've come out. So one of the things we've talked about is the balance of 19th century texts, which are specified in the national curriculum in terms of the different time periods from which we teach, the importance of modern writing that young people need to be exposed to, and also that the decolonising the curriculum has been important to us, and looking at diversity in writing so that our curriculum is truly reflective of modern society. And also going back to, reading is essentially about pleasure. It is essentially about, finding yourself in a different world which transports you from where you are or helps you to understand the world that you're in. So those have some of the areas that we've talked about.
The 19th century issue is quite a big one and quite an important one, I think.
It is.
How early do you start to prepare your students with 19th century stuff? Because in my school, I have students come in from all over the world, some of who've never experienced any Victorian literature to speak of, or even any English literature to speak of in their home countries, to be parachuted into year 10 or year 11 to then have to sit a language exam that requires them to know about 19th century boarding schools or the traditions of wearing hats in the street. Seems to me a bit much.
It is. I think when we look at the English curriculum as being centred in English schools, and you earlier referred to like the number of reports we've had over time, right from the Newbold report and earlier, is we know that we are coming through from university study years and years ago that the 19th century novel has been held up as the centre of perhaps our literary curriculum. It's obviously still considered important because it's a set area to be assessed on in English GCSEs, English literature GCSEs. We have to have a 19th century text in there. So obviously there's a lot of pleasure in reading a 19th century text and understanding that aspect of history. So for us, it's been a discussion about, do we put that in year 7? We previously had Oliver Twist, but we've moved that out. But we're thinking of focusing on in year 7 towards the end on perhaps either a novella or an extended short story. At the moment, we're just discussing H.G. Wells's Time Machine for a number of reasons, that it introduces not just a 19th century piece of writing, but also the science fiction genre and how interesting that would be. We teach A Christmas Carol at GCSE, so we want the students to be ready to access that, but we don't want to make it a Dickens heavy curriculum. I think the other issue with a lot of the 19th century novels is length and the time we have in the curriculum to teach those alongside the vast breadth of literature that we'd like to expose our young people to.
Yeah, the challenge of how you manage to get through everything in the time
Mm,
is a big one when you're dealing with 19th century stuff. And in terms of
mm.
the 19th century poetry, romantic poetry, do you get to look at that?
We do. Obviously, that's part of our anthology. We teach Educast in our school, and we've got a group of the Romantic poets in there, which we want our students to be able to access and understand. So currently, we've worked on a unit in Year 9 on the Romantics, which has been quite successful. We know we want to make some changes to it because we don't want it just to be seen as GCSE. We want to make sure students understand the true nature of the Romantics, and also that as a collective term, that's a retrospective labelling, and that each poet during that time period is very different. You know, I want to look really more at the Lake poets versus or the other poets, and look at Shelley and Byron together. So we do introduce that. I also want students, when we look at the different types of poetry that the romantic, I'm using my air quotes here, the romantic poets write, is that it includes a variety of forms. And we earlier talked about knowledge and what knowledge was, and context. And for me, part of knowledge and context is understanding where literary forms originate. So one of the things that we've introduced earlier this year is that we've just finished teaching is a unit on sonnets for Year 7, because we know that the sonnet form is quite fundamental to aspects of Shakespeare, but also to some of the poets then that we later study at GCSE. We want students to understand the significance of form as a part of English literary history as well. So we do want to teach the Romantics, but we also want to look at how perhaps the Romantics have influenced other poets later on.
Yeah, I suppose romanticism is again one of those particular topics where you could go very, very deep, very, very
Mm,
early and lose quite a lot as a consequence of doing
yes.
so. So, the romantic unit we teach is part of a unit we call Monsters and Machines, which
Well, that
combines
sounds
the
really
teaching of
interesting.
combines the teaching of the Industrial Revolution, because that
Yeah,
doesn't really happen on our history curriculum anymore
yeah,
at Key Stage 3, with the teaching of extracts from um, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in a very, very abridged form.
yes,
And then we look at maybe 6, 7 poems about the town and countryside. We look
yeah.
at Robert Burns' Address to Edinburgh, which is actually my favourite Burns poem, not least because it's in relatively conventional English for him. Bit of Wordsworth, bit of
Yeah.
Keats, bit of Byron, bit of Shelley. Um, and I think that's probably enough to give them a sense of what was going on and what people were annoyed. Oh, William Blake, of course, as well.
Absolutely.
What people were annoyed about and what was going on at the time. It's very,
Mm.
very difficult to misinterpret a Blake poem, it seems to me.
I would agree with you. And I think it's interesting, isn't it? I think the richness of our subject is that the infinite possibilities of combinations of poems and texts and non-fiction. And I think that's something that, has always made me enjoy teaching English, because everything you can teach romantics one year and introduce something slightly different or change the focus, but substantially deal with that as a period of literary history. If we go back to Atherton's, 4 domains, the history and development of literature, that we know that there are some stages that are key to students understanding how poetry or novels have changed over time. And you mentioned Frankenstein, which for me I think is a key text, and we want to make sure that female writers are fully represented in the curriculum. We had a conversation in school about the dominance of dead white European men, and how we deal with that. So one of the things that we've looked at as well is linking. We've introduced a study of the Gothic at the start of Year 8, which our students responded really well to. They were really engaged by it, and I use the term engagement cautiously because of what it means to some people, but it was something that the students avidly talked about in our pupil voice. We know we need to refine it a bit, but I want to be able to understand the link between the Gothic and the Romantics and the interplay of the writers that were involved with that. And I think it is a genre and a period of literary history that you can introduce in Key Stage 3 to develop the students' ability to read.
It pulls out some really quite interesting things teaching Gothic actually at Key Stage 3.
Yeah.
Although the slightly amusing thing from my perspective is that, of course, At the time these novels were being written, it was a highly disreputable genre, so much
It
so that
was.
many of the authors were ashamed to put their names on the title pages.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes we do need a little bit of the disreputable in the English curriculum because we can be very proper. And I think it's important that students understand that not that things that we see now as being part of literary history and part of the canon, actually at the beginning were not seen as central or important or respectable. I think that's really important that they see that.
And it makes me wonder too what contemporary texts you might be teaching that at the moment are borderline disreputable that might be appearing on Ofsted subject reports of the future.
I don't know. That's a hard one to answer. I mean, certainly, I would say for perhaps one of the things that I think is really important is the increase in diversity and perhaps the discussion around, sexuality and gender as well, which, it's been certainly something we've discussed in our school and how we are fully representative across all aspects of diversity, in introducing one of the texts that we're going to trial. As our wider reading, our form time reading is Alex in Wonderland, which is a text that's quite new to me. But we want to make sure that all of our young people and their experiences are represented. And you could look back under Section 28 maybe 20 years ago where that wouldn't have been acceptable at all. And I think it's really important that we deal with those texts and show young people that they matter in all forms.
That's an interesting point, isn't it? It takes us back to the wording of the review itself about the reasons for which teachers might make textual choices.
Yes.
And we need to look beyond, I think, the history and development of literature and possibly the craft of the writer too, to the fact that these texts mean something more broadly in the world.
Absolutely, I would agree with you. And we think about the text at the time, and some of, we look at Dickens as a social critic, and we look at we've already talked about some of the Gothic texts being disreputable and challenging, and delving into areas of sexuality that weren't approved in Victorian society. And I think it's really important that we do think about why we're choosing that text and who does it represent and what does it bring to our young people to include them in reading, because not all children automatically respond with pleasure to reading texts, and lots of young people feel excluded from the things that they from the text that we choose. We want children to understand, I think, that all texts are for them, no matter how complex or simple. But we it's a balance, isn't it, all the time about at the time that we have and the choices that we make.
Certainly is. I remember having various discussions with people over the years about our school teaching Anglo-Saxon and Old English in Year 7.
Yes.
When you sometimes speak to people and say, well, our students are studying Anglo-Saxon and Old English in Year 7, they ask you why you're studying anything so irrelevant. And you say to them, well, actually, have you not considered that Year 7 students quite like writing about monsters and heroes? And if we're teaching them a relatively straightforward version of Beowulf, followed by a bit of the Seafarer and the Wanderer, and then making up their own riddles, that sounds exactly a Year 7's cup of tea to me.
Absolutely. And when in the number of conversations that I've had with some of the pupils that I teach, where I've referenced something and they've referred to a game that they've played and said, oh, Nemesis, well, that's in such a game, miss, isn't it? So they bring an understanding from their cultural experiences to understanding to help them to understand the literature. And when we look at the narratology of gaming, I think it's really important that we make those connections. And the first unit that our young people study in Year 7 is the origins of stories, and we look at the development of the Western canon from Greek literature, but also going back to Gilgamesh. And I think that teaching them about Gilgamesh is really important. And some people might say, but why? And I say, well, it's the foundation of literature, and it's from a different part of the world, and students need to understand where stories came from and the pattern of stories. I'm a big fan of Christopher Booker's 7 Basic Plots. That I think that for me unravels quite the relationships between texts. And I'm a big fan of teaching pupils patterns. The schema and say, well, we might watch Superman or we might watch, Stranger Things. But actually, let's look at that story that's relevant right back to this. It follows this pattern. So all stories are built on the stories that precede them. And I think that teaching Beowulf or Chaucer is really important because it is a part of our heritage. Or for some people, it's saying, well, how might this link to the place that you've come from in terms of the ancient stories that you know? And we know that stories, writers link back to Chaucer, and then we've built on that. And I think it's very important that students see that.
It takes us back to the 4 domains again, doesn't it?
It
The
does,
second one being
yes.
the craft of the
To the
writer,
writer, yeah.
following the conventions you expect or suddenly surprising you by not doing so.
Mm.
And then the response of the reader, the ability to pick up on those signals being transmitted by the text, I suppose.
Mm.
How good
And
are your students now at picking up the transmitted conventions of the Gothic?
I think it's early days for us, but certainly when we asked them to write in the style of, we could see conventions and tropes coming through. And when we think about the craft of the writer, I think it also links back to other aspects of the review and the national curriculum as well, in terms of the teaching of grammar and sentence construction. Because one of the things that we looked at closely in the unit was, how are people described? How are scenes set up? What are the conventions of setting and weather? We talked about meteorological and the 2 other words escape me now because it's a Sunday and it's the start of the holidays. But we're teaching them very explicitly about these are the patterns. But we also talked about, how is this built up? Let's look at the noun phrases, let's look at the epithets, and then teaching those very explicit grammatical aspects of construction so that they can confidently construct their own texts. I mean, that's very much a work in progress, and we're still unpicking the explicit but contextualized teaching of grammar in the work that we're trying to do, because we know it's important that students see how things are constructed, because otherwise students don't necessarily understand the shape of sentences and then can't write accurately because they're confused about where perhaps commas go in a multi-clausal sentence, or how you might use a semicolon, for example. So those are things that we've been considering quite a lot, alongside rooting it in a robust study of a particular genre.
It's certainly interesting you mentioned the semicolon, because that's changed quite a bit since Anne Radcliffe's time, and even Thomas Hardy's time, actually.
Absolutely. But we know that when we look at the mark scheme for writing at GCSE, that the variety of punctuation and helping students use a semicolon could change them a mark band, perhaps, of 2 or 3 marks on the vocabulary, sentence structure, and punctuation. So, it does matter.
Certainly does, which is why I'm slightly surprised by, again, the wording of the subject review, suggesting
Yeah.
that students should be dissuaded from following kind of writing frames or
Yes.
templates in any kind of way.
Mm.
The exam format itself does tend to lend itself towards the templatization of responses often. Particularly, I'm thinking of those descriptive writing tasks on the English language paper 1 it is with AQA.
Yeah, I would agree with you that, and certainly, we know that when we teach Educast, that there's a narrative convention that they promote, and it's our duty to teach young people that convention so they can be successful. We sat down and we talked about, well, the way that they write an exam is not necessarily how we would want them to write their own short story or a novel, but our duty to young people is to get them the highest grade possible in their exam. So part of Key Stage 4 teaching for me is, what does the exam want us to do, and can we teach you to do that alongside other aspects? That I think we can focus on the exam specification as the curriculum, but we know that the curriculum is wider than that. It's just a balance of the time that we have. But writers follow conventions and always have. You see writers borrowing from one another. You see writers following patterns, and I I think that for some young people, the scaffolds and the writing frames and the writing in a style of help them to become much more confident writers. So I think it's very important.
Yeah, again, it's about giving them the bricks to work with to build their own creations, isn't it?
There are a number of writers who are prominent on social media who talk about, oh, I was not taught this, or I didn't need that. But actually, they're people who have got the tools and can break the rules as well. Whereas a lot of our young people need to be taught those tools and how to use them, and they need to start with following patterns like we would do with nursery rhymes in early years to make them successful and confident in writing, because not all of us are going to be award-winning novelists or poets, but we
There's
will
only a
want
limited number of awards.
there's only a limited number of awards, themselves and have
And I suppose on a serious point for a moment, there's actually a diminishing number of
yes,
awards available now for children's writing.
the Blue Peter one has gone, hasn't it? And the
W.H. Smith's one went some time ago.
and I think that's a real shame, considering that we're in a time of an absolute wealth of richness in terms of children's literature. It seems really sad, that we must fight for that recognition for those authors.
Certainly does. I have to say, from our conversation so far, Mary, that I'm certainly warming towards these 4 domains of literature as they're set out in the report. I just wonder how much of a surprise these will be to colleagues who are in teacher training institutions to suddenly find these new terms presented to them.
I think it very much depends on who you speak to. I mean, I know a couple of people who are in ITT, and I know that they will be well versed in what the report has said. But I do think there's a gap between what some people might be doing and then perhaps some visiting tutors and things, between how the knowledge filters down. But I think it's always about how something is interpreted or summarized, and the form in which, say, someone who's starting their PGCE in September, how that might be presented to them. And I think it's our job as teachers in the profession to support those new teachers to say, well, this is actually what it means, or this is how we interpret it, or this is the wider or richer view of it. I mean, as we've talked about it and interrogated them, they do seem logical, and they
certainly
actually
do.
come from a commitment and an understanding of the richness of literature. I think it's interesting. And I go back to what I've said about the structure of the report and what the report is trying to do. It's excellent, but I would much rather have had that in a kind of reflection, or this is the research review. Now, a discussion part for departments might be then to look at this 4 domains and how might you use that in terms of planning your curriculum. I do struggle with what the report has tried to do, the research review, and I think it's very different from a literature review, from the literature reviews that I've read in terms of the structure. It seems to at times think it's showing us the research that's out there, but at times it seems to be directing us to a particular way of teaching. And I think the language that it used, teachers can, teachers must, teachers should. There's a strong kind of sense of modal verbs throughout this, about it directing us towards a particular way of teaching. Perhaps rather than saying, this piece of research shows us X, how might that be useful to us in school? I do struggle with the way the research review has been written, if I'm honest.
I'm just thinking about the 4th domain, which we haven't really explored explicitly, I suppose, which is the nature of literary study. And
yes,
the report lumps a number of things under this heading, one of which is to include the role of literary study, literary criticism, and literary theory, how different approaches and ways of reading impact on what and how we read, how students value the study of literature, and so on. And I was struck, actually, we recently had an Ofsted inspection, and the English department inevitably was picked for a deep dive, and we were studying what were we studying? Well, we were teaching Year 8 students Antigone,
Yes.
and we were reading it in the unabridged Fagles translation, which I think is a fantastic text. And the inspector who was charged with giving us the once over was very amenable indeed, and was asking us about at what point in the curriculum we start talking about literary theory explicitly with our students. And we said, well, actually, we start in Year 7. We
Yeah.
start with our origins and myths unit about how English has developed from, classical patterns. We then take it through into Year 8 as we explore Antigone, struggle with Creon and the patriarchal state, and then it goes from there. I said clearly we don't talk to them about anything you'd expect to find on a A-level philosophy syllabus, but we do mention that the conflict between different genders in society has a name.
Yes.
The way in which creation is treated in Genesis or indeed in mythology from around the world has a kind of connection to environmentalism. So I think there
Absolutely.
are ways we can bring theory in that's relevant and truthful, even for those kind of younger students down the curriculum.
I agree, and I think it's saying, often that we will talk about, well, some people will interpret this as. I think it has to be done very sensitively because, as somebody who's marked exams, sometimes when you get to key state GCSE marking, you sometimes see an inappropriate over application of literary theory. Statements about X's. This is a Marxist approach because, and I think it's a lack of perhaps nuance in the teaching. Whereas I do think it's important for students to say, well, some people would view this as this, and so other people would criticism and might be like, and sometimes what we've done is introduce maybe single sentence statements about characters and ask the students to discuss them and what they think, particularly around, for me, it's the portray, how we interpret Lady Macbeth, and there's some very facile interpretations that we can have, and there's some more nuanced interpretations, and how we get students to understand those so that they can come to their own critical opinion. But it's about, so I think it's about seeding it as you go through about, at the time this may have been received as this. A view now might be, that particularly interrogating things around patriarchy, I think is really important for young people.
I suppose, of course, that brings us back again to this challenge of non-linearity in the way we like to think about our discipline and the way in which we like to think about forming the capacity of students to read text in their own imaginative ways.
Yes, I think we can look at progression, and we can look at building like deeper critical engagement with text and the expansion of pupils' ability to write analytically about text or to read text in different ways. We obviously want to expose students to texts of increasing vocabulary complexity or narrative complexity or increasing complexity of viewpoint. But I think a curriculum can't be like some perhaps maths or science where you can't move to one building block unless you've got another building block below that. I think English there's ways of putting the blocks together that's much more about schema and patterns than perhaps it is from one linear point to the next. But I think it's really important that as a department you sit down and you discuss what that is and how all the knowledge links together and what we do want as an essential precursor to something that they do later on.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I tend to view our English curriculum, if we're doing it right, as a pilgrimage towards understanding rather than a route march.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you.
And I think we're just about out of time, Mary. So it's been fantastic discussing this complex document, which in itself has facilitated a number of different interpretations with you this evening. I hope you've enjoyed being on the air with us tonight.
It's been an absolute privilege, and it's always lovely to be able to talk about one subject and the decisions that we make as individuals and in departments and share that with other people. And And I'd be interested to see what sort of feedback or responses we get to the programme and what people think of the research review as well.
Yeah, we'd love to get your thoughts on how this review takes life in your department, perhaps once we move into the next academic year. That'd be really interesting to see what challenges have actually been thrown up by being back in the classroom with the students in front of us. Thank you very much, Mary.
Oh, thank you very much, Christopher. Thank you for it's been a pleasure to be your guest on the show. Thank you for asking me.
Again, enjoy your holiday.
I will do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye. And so we've reached the end of this month's Late Show, in which I hope we have helped you gain some understanding of the debates around the Ofsted English Subject Review and given you some ideas for how you might address some of its themes in your schools, departments and classrooms in September. I hope Mary's thoughts have prompted you to think a bit more about the English curriculum you wish your students to receive and the ways in which you might deliver it. Thank you again to Mary Hind-Portley for joining us on Teachers Talk Radio tonight. Thanks to everyone who has tuned in and texted the show. We've had a couple of texts in. We've got more great shows lined up for you in the coming week on Teachers Talk Radio, both on Podbean and on Twitter Spaces. So do check out the schedule on www.ttradio.org to make sure you're up to date with the holiday pattern and have spent some time getting to know our new hosts Mark Cratchley and Jeff Pedley. Remember, you can download and catch up with every Teachers Talk Radio show on the website's Listen Again facility, with shows on an ever-increasing range of topics to inform, inspire, and entertain. That's it from me for this month, so thank you for listening. Enjoy your summer holiday, whether you are travelling to somewhere exotic, taking a well-deserved staycation, or simply refamiliarising yourself with family and friends. And we will speak again in August. Goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.